That's right. Now that you're here, we can begin. Mishpatim, making tough choices, grabbing onto the reins of life. That's the title for tonight's lesson. And we know that this week's Parsha is called Parshas Mishpatim, which means ordinances or laws, civil laws. And in it, we have all kinds of different important laws that God gives us that relate to creating a civilized society. Things like outlawing bribery. Bribery. Don't bribe the judges. That's not okay. Yeah. No bribery. Rules for custodians and guardians. These are basic civil laws that are required to create a civil society. And that all appears in this week's Parshas Mishpatim. However, a very peculiar law opens Parshas Mishpatim, and what makes it even more peculiar is the fact that it's the first law that apparently is related after the giving of the Torah. It begins with this opening strange law about slaves, and not just ordinary slaves, but Jewish slaves. And the slave is a certain period of time that he's going to remain enslaved, and then what happens if he wants to stay a slave? This is all very interesting, and we're going to take a look at this in text number 1. So here's what it says. Fred, you with us?
I'm listening.
All right. Am I talking and you're listening? Is that the way it works?
Yes.
Okay. Page 64. A lot of other people are listening. Page 64. Text number 1. And these are the ordinances that you shall set before them. Should you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall work for 6 years, and in the 7th year he shall go out to freedom without charge. If he comes in alone, meaning he's not married, comes in alone, then he shall go out alone. If he is a married man, his wife shall go out with him. Fair enough? So far, so good?
Got it.
No, I don't get why there's slaves anyway.
That's a great question. Let me respond to that question as soon as we're done with the text. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go free, his master shall bring him to the judges, and he shall bring him, or they shall bring him to the door, or he shall bring him to the door or to the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. Forever means for 50 years. The term forever is a reference to a yovel. Yovel is a jubilee year. So to your question, Lois, why is there slavery altogether? That's a great question. And I believe that Judaism, at least in comparison to any other ancient religion, had the most protective laws for slaves. In those days, you could do whatever you wanted with a slave. You can abuse your slave, you can beat him, you can do all kinds of things, you can starve him. But the Torah has very specific laws about how you need to treat a slave. Now, the question might be asked, well, in today's day and age in America, thank God we've abolished slavery.
Maybe that's where they learned it from.
To abolish slavery.
No, I mean,
that's a fantastic thing.
Africans,
What I'm saying is that the
slaves.
Torah was responding, God is responding to a reality. People had slaves. It's only until very recently that slavery was abolished in the first place. So you're asking, why does the Torah speak about it? Because that was the reality. People had slaves. People just had, all peoples, all society, everybody had slaves. It wasn't like, the secular world came up with this idea, we're going to abolish slavery thousands of years ago, and the Torah endorsed slavery. It's just the opposite. The Torah actually is saying, as we'll study soon, God is saying we are to be God's servants. He wants us to be His servants. He doesn't want us to be servants for other servants, for human servants. So, how does it happen that a person becomes a slave in the first place? So this takes us to the very opening of the 10 Commandments, which we read this last week's Parshas Yisro, where God says to us very clearly, I am the Lord your God, in text number 2a, who took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. I took you out of slavery. You shall not have the gods of others in my presence. God is saying, I took you out of bondage. used to be slaves for the Egyptians, and now I've removed you from those circumstances, and I don't want you to be subject to anybody else. You are to be subject to me, God says.
Or to have slaves, like the hire.
He doesn't say that.
It doesn't say
He doesn't say that. God does not say that. He doesn't say not to have slaves. Because don't forget, in the olden days, I mean, thousands of years ago, if you wanted to get things done, right? How did you get things done?
Workers.
You needed workers. You needed people so these people came and they said, okay, we're going to work for you. You're going to provide for us, and we'll work for you. That, in other words, is a slave. That's what it means. You wanted to build a home. How'd you build a home? How'd you get things? How'd you make supper? You needed. There was a tremendous amount of labor that went into it. We today we take it for granted. We go to the store and buy a loaf of bread. Go to the bakery, buy a loaf of bread. But how many hours of physical labor would it take to make that one loaf of bread? In terms of beginning, you're talking about plowing the field, planting the field, reaping the field, and then attending to it while it's growing. I mean, there are so many things that have to be done just for the one loaf of bread. So it wasn't a simple life, a very different type of life than we have today. It's very hard for us to imagine what it must have been like. So God says, I want you to be my servants. I don't want you to be servants for anybody else. In text number 2b, Rashi tells us, who took you out of the land of Egypt. Taking you out of Egypt is sufficient reason for you to be subservient to me. I saved you from there. I took you out. I took you out from the lion's den. And now I want you to be my servants. This is what God's message is to the Jewish people. So how does it happen that a Jew becomes a servant for somebody else? Rambam tells us in text number 3a. Basically, let me just tell you what he's going to tell us, and then we'll tell us, and we're going to then tell each other what they told us. Ever heard that expression? Tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. That's the way you would communicate. So here's what he's going to tell us. He's going to tell us that there are two possibilities where a person might end up, God forbid, in slavery. Where might that be? Number one, a person may have stolen. Must have, ended up in a very destitute situation. And instead of finding other means of support, taking loans and things like that, he decided it was best to rob a bank or the like. So the Beth Din, the Sanhedrin, the High Court, will then go and sell him if there's no other option. Sell him as a slave if there's no other option to pay back. It's one possibility. The other possibility is that a guy in a destitute situation decided he is going to sell himself as a slave without having to steal anything. He's just going to go and sell himself. You could imagine how pressing of a situation it might be that would lead a person to those circumstances, to go and sell themselves. People must be very down and out to be, to be in that place where you're ready to sell yourself to be able to earn a few dollars. Okay, so in text number 3a. Text number 3a, the term Hebrew servant used in the Torah refers to a Jew whom the court sells by compulsion, or a person who sells himself willingly. Those two possibilities. One is implied. When a person steals and does not have the resources to repay the principal, the court tells him, as we have explained in the laws of conserving, the court sells him, as we have explained in the laws concerning thievery. To what does the term a person who sells himself refer? When a Jew becomes sorely impoverished, the Torah gives him permission to sell himself as a servant, as Vayikra, meaning Leviticus 25:39 states, when your brother will become impoverished and be sold to you. A person is not allowed to sell himself as a servant and stash away the money. Use it to buy merchandise or utensils or give it to his creditor. He may sell himself only when he needs the money for his very livelihood. A person is not permitted to sell himself unless he has no property remaining at all. Even his clothing no longer remains. Only in such a situation may he sell himself. So this person is absolutely destitute. He's got nothing but the shirt on his back. And only then does the Torah say, okay, you can go and sell yourself as a slave. Now, we learned earlier that if he comes in married, and he leaves married, if he comes in married, then his master can also give him a maidservant with whom he will have children, and those children will belong to the master. And in text number 3b, a Hebrew servant is not permitted to marry a Canaanite maidservant unless he already has a Jewish wife and children. If, however, he does not have a Jewish wife and children, his master may not give him a Canaanite maidservant. This concept is part of the oral tradition. In other words, this comes from Sinai. Why is it like that? There's no explanation here, over here per se. But in general, obviously, we're not allowed to marry someone who's not Jewish. If a person is in a situation where he's a slave, and he's married already to a Jewish person, the Torah provides this suspension of the law to allow him to get married to a maidservant. This way, he could benefit the master, because by having children from this non-Jewish maidservant, these children will then, in turn, remain in slavery by their master, and that is allowed by the Torah. He would be allowed to marry a non-Jewish, a Canaanite maidservant. Now, we can challenge this law, but that's not really the focus of our class. This is obviously a difficult question, like why would this be okay? Why? So that needs clarity, but it's really not the focus of tonight's lesson. So from this law, we can understand that the circumstances surrounding a person who became an Eved Nirtza, meaning a slave who had his ear bored and pierced, is obviously a very difficult situation. He had absolutely no money, he had no way of supporting himself, and so, okay, this is what the Torah says, and in the worst circumstances, this is what you can do. But the question is, what's this whole idea of piercing? And I'm punishing this person after 6 years of being in slavery. Why are we piercing his ear?
To mark him.
So mark him earlier. He's a slave, right? Mark him earlier. Mark him as soon as he becomes a slave.
Well, but then they're amongst their own. This is after he's ready to go.
And he says, I don't want to go, I want to stay. So suddenly, because he says he wants to stay after 6 years, now you're going to mark him? If you're afraid the guy's going to run away, you give him a mark right away.
It separates the,
Okay.
And they say, oh,
I'll tell you, I have a better idea.
That guy, he liked it here. He wants to stay. The guys with the piercings, come over here.
Okay,
What's your idea?
I hear what you're saying. There's definitely some truth to that, and I think we're going to come around back to some of this idea a little bit later. But just for argument's sake, if you wanted to separate the periods, before and after, you can make him a big kiddush in shul, serve a special cholent and a special kugel, and this is the slave kugel. This is the slave cholent. We're making him now official slave. Everybody come and taste the cholent, and everybody will remember. Right? You remember when we had a special kiddush in honor of you, right? You remember we ate that cholent. We had that cholent special in honor of you becoming a slave. I'm just kidding, but I'm also serious. In other words, there's other ways to do this. We don't have to pierce somebody's ear. We don't have to injure the guy.
You can give him a Rolex.
Give him maftir, give him an aliyah in the shul.
Mitzvot that he's obligated to, do they also go down in that?
Oh, yes. There are some mitzvahs that he's not obligated. I'll give you an example. Kibbut Avim, honoring his parents, would be something that he cannot fulfill because he's now subject to the whims of a new master.
So not to be crude, but it's a castration that everybody sees. It's to show that he's not a full man anymore.
But why do it now at 6 years? Do it at the beginning.
Now with the
He, in other words, he loses the obligation of certain obligations that he has. I mean, generally speaking, a Jewish slave is still obligated in the 613. But certain obligations he's simply not able to fulfill, like Kibbut Avim, like honoring his parents.
Not obligated anymore because,
Good, so what I'm saying is, the case I'm making is pierce him right at the beginning. If that's the case, yeah? If that's the case, you want to say that here, by his choice, he went down a level.
When he first came into the...
He's not giving up an opportunity to get out of it.
Oh.
There's still an idea that maybe in 6 years he's
Very
gonna
good.
get his situation right, he'll leave this lifestyle.
Excellent. Excellent point.
He served his term, so he should be leaving.
He should be leaving. Absolutely. So let's give this. This is a good answer. Let's give it some meat and potatoes. Let's give it some flesh and sinews. Not just the skeleton. Let's give it some more meat.
Speaking of meat and potatoes, what am I not looking at?
Water.
Amongst other things.
Well, that's fleischigs. And usually we have milchigs on Monday night here. So I hope Benny, if he's listening to us, Benny Pizza will bring his pizza finally. We're all waiting for you. Okay. So here the Torah tells us in text number 4a, it describes the attitude of this slave that we're talking about. And it will be if he says to you, I will not leave you, because he loves you and your household, for it is good for him with you. So clearly we're talking about a guy who's saying, you know what? I actually like this. This is actually pretty cool. This is pretty cool. I'm married. Not just that, I have a maidservant, and I have more children, and I don't have to worry about their livelihood because my master worries about that.
If there's a single blanket or a single pillow, he gets it first.
Yeah, that's right. We got to take good care of him. Text 4b. The sages taught, for it is good for him with you. What does that mean? What does that imply? The slave is truly with you. You're equal in food, you're equal in drink. You may not eat fine bread while he eats inferior bread. You may not drink aged wine while he drinks new wine. You may not sleep on soft sheets while he sleeps on straw.
Where do I sign?
From here, the sages taught, anyone who acquires a Hebrew slave, it is as if he acquired a master for himself, since he is responsible for giving the slave everything equal to his own. So you see, the Torah is very careful about how we treat slaves. It's not like in other parts of the world or other peoples, other societies, where slaves were abused. Here, you got to take good care of your slave. You got to give him everything that you have,
It's almost like there should be another word.
rather than slave.
Well, we said worker.
Indentured servant.
Indentured servant or something.
Yeah, indentured servant. So here you see that the Torah is very careful about how we treat him. And you know what? It's possible that the guy will come to enjoy his circumstances. You know, this is actually pretty good. It's not a bad idea. You know, I'll recommend it to another friend of mine who was destitute and had to steal. I'll tell him, you know, it's not so bad down here. So, what's the reason for this? Why do we pierce his ear? So Rashi, on the verse, in text number 5 tells us, why was the ear chosen to be bored out of all the organs of the body? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, the ear that heard on Mount Sinai, you shall not steal, and then went and stole, shall be pierced. And if the text is referring to one who sold himself into servitude, the reason is that the ear that heard, for the children of Israel are slaves to me, and then went and acquired a master for himself, this ear shall be pierced.
So option B makes perfect sense. The first one a lot less so.
I'm sorry, come again?
The second opinion makes plenty sense, but the first one, if that's the case, then like immediately once he's found guilty, it should happen.
Correct. But we don't do that. We don't do that. We don't pierce the ear of just somebody who steals.
But they heard on Mount Sinai.
They did, correct. They heard on Mount Sinai, but
Put in the 6 years.
for some reason, it's an excellent question. That's it's one of our questions. For some reason, the guy who steals doesn't get his ear bored. The guy who violates honoring his parents doesn't have his ear bored. Who does? The guy who sells himself. Why? Because God said at Sinai that you are to be servants of mine and not servants to anybody else. And the question is bewildering.
But not even the
It's
one
striking.
Who sells himself, the one who stays post 6 years.
Oh, exactly. So
Judaism,
what is this all about?
Judaism doesn't believe in punishment per se. They believe in rehabilitation. So that's why they don't pierce his ear when he's
Initially.
They want to rehabilitate him, so he shouldn't steal.
That's right. That's right. That's absolutely correct. We want to rehabilitate him. We hope that he ultimately is going to make the right choice. We'll get to that soon. But let's first ask the questions. Number one, why do we pierce him? What's the point? Number two, why don't we pierce the one who disregarded honoring his parents or stealing? Why is it specifically this guy? And I think some of the answers that were given have already responded to that question. We'll get back to it in Mitzvah Hashem a little later. It's also very strange that we pierced the ears of both the slave who sold himself into slavery, as well as the slave who ended up in slavery because he stole and couldn't pay it back, and therefore had no other means of paying it back other than becoming a slave of somebody. We treat them equally. Either one, once he stays there after 6 years, he gets pierced. Also, we don't pierce them at the beginning, we pierce them after 6 years. And also, but perhaps even more profoundly, why does Parshas Mishpatim, the parsha that contains all of these laws about civil society, why does it begin with such a peculiar law about somebody who wasn't supposed to sell himself as a slave and sold himself as a slave, and therefore symbolically we pierce his ear? Why is that important to point out before we launch into a discussion about guardians, about not taking bribery, about all other areas of civil law? Why is that important? What's the message here? There must be some kind of message here that's important, that frames all the other laws in a context and in a light that will provide the correct approach to all those other laws. There must be something to it. And why is this the first mitzvah after Matan Torah? So a couple of the questions I think we've answered to a degree, but let's get to it. Let's begin with the whole notion that law is a dispassionate, just, and precise exercise. No compassion. There's no room for compassion in law. It's either you did it or you didn't do it. You deserve it, you don't deserve it. That's what it would seem. That's what law is meant to be, right? Anybody disagree? That's usually the way things operate. Okay. I guess in some courtrooms, the judges have some leeway, and they may...
No space for
interpretation.
No prosecutors, no attorneys. There's a code, like a Hammurabi or something.
And that's it. So, even though this is our conception of law, but the truth of the matter is, from the Torah perspective, there is room for compassion even for the thief. It's funny, I've been posting on Facebook, I've been posting these little notices about our upcoming course, Crime and Consequence. So I typically get a reaction, like a like or a share or something like that. And by the way, if you're on Facebook and you notice then, please do share, please do like. It creates traction and attention, and more people see it and more people sign up for the course. So please help out in that way if you're able to. Okay, having said that, I posted different things, different little blurbs about this course. The last one that I did, at least last I checked, it didn't get any likes or any shares. Why? I'm guessing that the message of that blurb was discover the humanity within the criminal. Discover the goodness even within the criminal. I think people have a adverse reaction to that, because if a person's a criminal, let him do his time. A person stole, a person murdered, let them be punished, and let's not have any compassion for that person. That's usually the human reaction, especially if they stole from you. Not of defense attorneys, because they're getting paid for it. But
but they choose to do that rather than be a prosecutor.
Correct. I'm not going to disagree that there's no room for it, but I'm saying usually our gut reaction, knee-jerk reaction is, what do you mean? Why should we have compassion? What do you mean? Why discover the humanity? We should throw them, lock them away and throw away the key. Often that's the response. I'm not saying that's the right response. I think the case that the course is making is that we need to reconsider that. But I noticed I didn't get any likes for that one. All right. So the truth of the matter is, from a Jewish perspective, from a Torah perspective, there is room for compassion. Where do we see that? In text number 6, we read from Mishlei. This is from King Solomon, the wisest of men. He says the following. He says, they will not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy his appetite, for he is hungry. In the Talmud text number 7, 3 things cause a person to act against his will and the will of his creator. And one of them is extreme poverty. What are the practical ramifications of this idea? It allows us to request mercy for those people acting against their will. We need to have mercy. We have to recognize the humanity even within criminals. Fred, do you agree?
I totally agree.
Okay. If Fred agrees, I think we're ready to continue. Okay. Let me tell you a story about one of the great Hasidic masters, and don't get put off from the introduction to the story. There was a great Hasidic master, his name was Rabbi Baruch of Mezhebush. He was a grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. Now, he was a very sharp man, and he was a very intense person. There were some Hasidic leaders who he disagreed with in terms of their approach. As we know, there are many different types of Hasidus, different students of the Baal Shem Tov. Just one second. Jeff, can I trouble you? Would you mind just putting up the heat? Yeah, there's one in the corner and one in that corner. If you don't mind just taking a look. Yeah, if you don't, one in that corner, one in that corner. Thank you. Okay, so Rabbi Baruch of Mezhebush was very devout in his style, and there were others that he didn't really appreciate, or he didn't appreciate their approach. That doesn't make him right. It just makes him, he would have a certain, righteous indignation towards those of, who weren't his style. Having said that, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, the famous Hasidic master, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, was one of the great Hasidic teachers and leaders of Hasidus, who Rabbi Baruch and he didn't see eye to eye. Didn't see eye to eye. So, comes the Shabbos in Rabbi Baruch's Beis Medrash, and again I ask you, please don't get put off by this, the beginning of the story. He says, anybody who can come to me and say something about Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, tell me something negative about Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, I'm offering him a portion in the world to come. Portion in the world to come. Who's not going to do it for a portion of the world to come? You think everybody's going to come forward with some Lashon Hara about Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, right? Well, that didn't happen. One guy tried to go, and his friend stopped him. No, don't go. It's okay. He's asking, but really, I'm telling you, it's not for your benefit. He wants to go. All right, the next day comes along Shabbos morning, and Rabbi Baruch of Mezhebush makes the same offer, and he says, whoever has something bad to say about Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, please come forward.
Always hold there. You certainly don't use word holding.
Jeff, is it on heat? Is it on heat? Do you put like permanent hold?
Yeah.
70. Okay, so it's on heat though, right? Yeah. It should start heating up. Okay, so the next morning he repeats his offer, and again this guy tries to go up, but he's held back. He's held down by his friends. Finally, the third meal of Shabbos comes along, and this guy couldn't contain himself any longer when Rabbi Baruch made his offer, which nobody had taken up throughout the entire Shabbos. This guy says, okay, I'm going to be the one to come up, and I'm going to say some Lashon Hara about Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev. And boy, did he have what to say. Let me tell you what he said. He says, Rabbi Baruch, you know what happened? I was by Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, and I'm standing there in the middle of davening, and when we come to the section of davening that talks about the angels on high, he comes over, and he runs over to me, and it looks like he's very angry. And he says to me, what will the angels on high say? What are they going to say? It's the middle of davening. Now, you're not allowed to interrupt the middle of davening. You're not allowed to interrupt the middle of davening. And this guy, there's Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, in the middle of davening, when it came to the words Yotzei Misharsim V'Asher Misharsim, talks about the angels, he goes and he makes this interruption, and he says, what's Malach Michal going to say? What's, Michal, Michael, right? Or Gabriel? What are they going to say? What are they going to say? So, whichever way you look at it, we have a problem here because he interrupted in his prayers. This is supposed to be a righteous rabbi, a Hasidic rabbi who's supposed to know the law. What is this all about? Well, Reb Baruch sits there and listens, and he says, let me tell you something about Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev. Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev is the great advocate of the Jewish people on high. He's the great advocate. He's always defending the Jewish people. And he's always defending and speaking favorably about Jews. And in the course of their morning prayers, Jews in the world reach the passage that speaks of the ministering angels who stand in the heights of the universe. That's the moment at which Michal and Gavriel and all their hosts speak in defense of the house of Israel, seeking to have them acquitted of the charges that have been laid against them. And when Reb Levi Yitzchak reaches that point, he joins the chorus. He says, yes, they're correct. The Malachim are correct. The angels are correct. However, when he suddenly saw you, meaning this guy, you're telling me, Nashon Hari, you're telling me something bad about Reb Levi Yitzchak. Let me tell you what happened. Reb Levi Yitzchak saw you, and he noticed and he was able to see that what you did last night wasn't exactly the most moral of things. And so he came over to you in the middle of davening and he said, what are the angels going to say? What are the angels, how could they defend you? How are they going to be able to defend you? You just did something that's not so nice. You didn't understand what he was saying. But he actually was looking for your benefit. He was looking to advocate for you. So this young man was quite shaken. And he was obviously very ashamed, and felt great regret for what he did. And he begged his Rebbe to provide him with some pathway to repentance. And so he said that the only tzaddik, the only person who could help you reach repentance and to atone for your sin that you did in secrecy is Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev. And so ultimately he came around. Ultimately he did tshuva. What was his sin? His sin was that he stole. Why did he steal? Probably because he was very poor. So what's the point of the story? The point of the story is one thing, not about Rabbi Levi Yitzchak being able to see what actually took place, not about Rabbi Baruch of Mezhbuz being able to defend Rabbi Levi Yitzchak or the angels, etc., etc. The point of the story was that when a person steals, it's most often, unless they have a kleptomania, they are usually stealing because they feel like they're in a very tough spot financially. So the Eved, the slave that we're talking about, is somebody who was in a very difficult situation. He was a very poor person. In text number 8 we read from the Mittel Rebbe, he says, the sinner will immediately and automatically weep upon recalling the evil actions and thoughts of his heart, which were only evil all the day. It's just a quote from a pasuk. This constitutes the true chastening and humbling of the heart itself. The heart of the poor and impoverished man is chastened by the straits of his destitution and his suffering in matters of children, health, and wealth. And he will cry out with a bitter soul at the immediate thought of his situation. As soon as a poor person who is in that kind of situation remembers or thinks of his circumstances, immediately they break down emotionally. So too should the soul of the sinner cry over his sins in humility and absolute contrition, with a constantly broken and forsaken heart, like a poor man who is always humble and contrite. The Mittel Rebbe's point here that we want to focus on is the fact that the poor person is so broken that the mere thought of his situation will cause him to break down in tears. So it's not surprising that a person like this will sell himself into slavery. All of these, the text and the story was in order to give context for this point. Think about it. A person in those circumstances, destitute, has absolutely no money, bills from here to the zoo, from here to Texas, Okay, not Texas, Alabama. You know, people like that are going to sell themselves. They'll do things that they wouldn't normally do. In these circumstances where he has to sell himself, what happens? Or he has to steal and then he ultimately is sold, or he has to sell himself on his own. He ends up marrying a maidservant. Now what happens with the maidservant? Okay, so she's now his wife. Now it's a natural thing for a person to create a bond, an emotional bond with his family. It's just natural. God made it that way. And in fact, in text number 9, we read from the Talmud, Rabbi Kahana said, what does the verse refer to when it says, for he spoke, meaning God spoke and it was, he commanded and it stood? Says the Talmud, he spoke and it was, this is a wife. He commanded and it stood, this is children. What does this mean? That a person's emotional attachment to their wife and children is something that God ingrained within the very fabric of creation. So what do you want from the guy? What do you want from the guy? He's destitute. He stole. He was sold into slavery. Or he was just simply destitute, and therefore he sold himself into slavery. And now he ends up with his Shifcha Kanainis, with his maidservant, his Canaanite maidservant. And you know what? Yeah, he loves his wife and children. He's in a very deep rut. So why are we piercing this here? So let's first establish that, yes, it's true, there are different types of challenges that people experience. People have all kinds of experiences, some easier, some harder, some more difficult, some more challenging. Sometimes we're asked to do things that are completely beyond our comfort zone. Very challenging, extremely challenging things to do. But ultimately, we have to make a choice. In the situation that this poor person has found himself in, what are the choices that he had? One choice that he has is to borrow money. He could borrow money. And in fact, in this week's Parshas itself, the Torah tells us, Im kesef talve esami. Im means usually, if you will, and the rest of the verse means, if you will loan money to the people of my nation, actually. And Rashi tells us, based on Rabbi Yishmael's teachings, it's not just if you will, but in this context, you are going to, meaning I'm commanding you. You will lend money to my people. Meaning it's a mitzvah to lend somebody money, interest-free, if they are in circumstances where they need it. It's a mitzvah.
How do they differentiate whether the person should be lent to or given charity to?
I don't think there's a we wouldn't draw a distinction on our own. It's more about what the person himself is up to. We hope that the person will take a loan. It's much better for a person to take a loan. It's much better for a person to ultimately, reestablish himself on his own feet. Taking charity, nobody likes to take charity. No one likes to take handouts. And within charity itself, there are all kinds of different levels of how to give charity. That we have levels for, and the law has what to say about. You can do charity in multiple ways. There are 8 different levels within charity. The best way to do charity is to give somebody a job, so that they can support themselves. That is the very best way a person could do charity. Instead of relying on handouts, give them an opportunity to be able to earn their own living. So anyway, getting back to the point here, the person who was destitute had a choice. What was their choice? To borrow money. In text number 10, when you lend money to my people, to the poor person who was with you, you shall not behave towards him as a lender, you shall not impose interest upon him. And says the Mechilta to Shmos. Mechilta is a rabbinic text all the way back before the Mishnah was composed. It's usually Mechilta of Rabbi Shmuel or Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And in text number 11, he says the following: when you lend money to my people, Rabbi Shmuel said, every im, this was the point I made earlier, every word im in Hebrew, the first word in our verse, in the Torah is understood to be optional. If you do it, except for this one and 2 others, which are commands, meaning it is compulsory to lend money to the poor, not optional. If you are faced with the poor of your family and the poor of your city, The poor of your family take precedence. If you are faced with the poor of your city and the poor of a different city, the poor of your city take precedence. Since the verse says, the poor person with you. Now, borrowing money, of course, is embarrassing, and it is difficult, and it also places a huge burden on the borrower. And this is borne out in a text here, in text number 12, in the verse here in Mishlei, another verse from Mishlei. A rich man will rule over the poor, and a borrower is a slave to a lender. A borrower is a slave to a lender.
It can go even deeper than that. It could be a big sort of error on the part of the lender if, I don't know by what kind of metric this could be accomplished, but if the lender sees the borrower as somebody who probably can't pay him back, probably will not be able to, you're setting him up for disaster. It's a stumbling block in front of a blind man, isn't it?
If the guy can't pay you back.
If you're pretty sure that the guy's he's just not that kind of guy. He can't. He's not built for it. Not everybody is.
So there are halachas about that. I don't remember exactly what is stated. I don't remember. We wrote a paper about this from Mochen Shmuel. I don't remember.
The last two kidneys. I know, for instance, somebody completely ruined their last two.
As a result of lending money to somebody who couldn't pay back.
I mean, let's say either dollars or kidneys, right? I know somebody burnt $100,000 because they're some kind of addict, or because they're not intellectually sound, or say theatrically sound.
Right.
Or burnt a kidney and then burnt another one. I'm loath to give them another $100,000 or another kidney.
For sure.
Because they just don't have a good history.
Okay, I hear that, and I believe there are halachas about this. I don't recall.
Yet another serious sin on their shoulders instead of helping them.
Again, like I said, I think there are halachas about this, and that and it would preclude. In other words, a person would not be obligated in those circumstances if it was clear that the person cannot pay back. I just don't remember the details. I'd have to go back and look in. We wrote a paper about this from Mochen Shmuel. I don't remember what the details are. But having said that, I want to just share a brief story that I read to my children this Shabbos, having mentioned Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev. And there's a great story about him where a person passed away in his town, in his city. Berditchev was a wealthy man. And although Rabbi Levi Yitzchak would not generally attend funerals, every funeral, he wasn't going to go out to every funeral, but this particular man he went out for. They asked him, why? Why did you go out to this funeral? So he says, let me tell you about this guy. And he begins to share a number of stories. I'll just share one of them. I believe he shared 3 stories about the unique character of this person. There was a man who came from a neighboring town, small town around Berditchev, where he had a store. He was a poor man, and what he would normally do is he would collect money, he would borrow money, and buy merchandise in the big city of Berditchev, and then go back to his store in the townlet and sell the merchandise there, and repay his loans, and hopefully make some kind of cut off of all of this, on top of all of that. So he one time borrowed a lot of money from other people in the town, people of means. He went into the big city of Berditchev, and somewhere in the marketplace, he turns around and he sees the money is gone. And he's crying and he's screaming, and the whole crowd forms around him. Forms around him. And he's telling people, I borrowed money. I don't have money to buy any merchandise. I don't have money now to pay these guys back. I have nothing. Now I'm only in debt. And a big crowd is forming around him. And there's one guy that comes along and says, you know what? I think I found your money. Tell me, what did you have? Like what was, what kind of bills did you have? What kind of coins did you have? He gives them all the identifying factors. I had 50, rubles like this, gold coins and silver coins, whatever it was. He says, yeah, I think I might have found it. I think I might have found it. I think I have it. Let me just go check in my house. I think I found it. And he goes home and he takes out the entire sum that this guy claimed he lost, and he gives it to him. The guy is very, very happy. But the thing, but listen to the rest of the story. The guy who stole it from him was actually in that crowd around him as he's listening to this poor fellow cry his eyes out. He doesn't have any money. The thief is standing there. And he sees the way this rich fellow goes home, says, yeah, I think I found it, goes home and takes money and gives him the money. So the thief later comes over to him, quietly, and he's to the wealthy man who gave the money that he didn't have to. And he says, I want to tell you the truth. I took the money. I want to give it back to you because I see what happened here. And he refuses to take the money. So he calls him to a din Torah by Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev. The thief calls the wealthy man that he doesn't want to take it. Now, the end of the story is not important whether he was coerced to take it or not. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Berditchev says, that's the guy who died. The wealthy man who gave the money and would refuse to take the money back from the real thief. That's why I'm going to his Levium. That's why I'm going to his funeral. He deserves it. Just a story about lending money, about borrowing money, about stealing money. It's got all the elements that our class talks about. Okay. So having said that, when a person borrows money, they become a slave, they become a servant to the lender. There is a degree of that. There is a degree, at least psychologically, where you feel like you don't want to see that person. And in fact, the Torah tells you, if the due date has already passed, avoid the guy. You're the lender, avoid him. So he shouldn't feel pressured and embarrassed and ashamed that he hasn't yet paid you back. Okay. So we all have our own challenges, right? But this guy had this challenge. And the correct choice would have been to borrow money and find a way to pay back. But he didn't do that. Instead, he decided to sell himself. Or he decided to steal and sell, and then he was sold. So it's true, yes, we'll have mercy on the guy, we'll have empathy, compassion, and etc., etc. But we are expecting, as was correctly pointed out earlier, we are expecting that over this period of time of 6 years, you will try to rise up and make yourself whole, somehow. And not say at the end of the 6 years, this is quite cool. I like it here. I like it down here. We expect a person to take responsibility, take his life into his own hands, and put himself in the driver's seat and say, okay, we're going to do things differently from now on. We're expecting things to change. The person didn't do that. He's saying, I like it here. I like it here. Okay. Now, your ear has to be bored. So in text number 13.
Or I'm scared about there.
He says, "Ahafti es Adoni." I love my master. I love my wife. I love my children. I like it. It's good. He takes good care of me. I'm a slave, but it's okay. I'm okay being a slave. God says, I don't want you being slaves. I want you to be my servant.
Everybody's a slave to something.
Everybody? We could be slaves to our own impulses. That's true. But the whole idea is to rise above that. Let the impulses be slaves to us, not us be slaves to the impulse.
If you're in the office 15 hours a day to not be an Eved, is that not being a slave?
Well, I think you demonstrate that you are not a slave by coming to the shir. You could have made the choice that you want to still be an Eved, and instead you said, no, I'm not going to be an Eved. I'm going to come to learn Torah.
I opened up a practice, and somebody was so impressed with how incredibly elegant that sounded, right? To not go to a hospital or join an agency, but to open up a private practice and be your own boss.
Mm-hmm.
I said it is amazing being your own boss because it's absolutely your choice which 15 hours you want to work that day.
Okay, well said. So in text number 13, when first becoming a slave, we do not punish the man by piercing his ears, since he is compelled by difficult circumstances. However, if after 6 years of slavery he claims, I love my master, and does not seek his freedom, this proves that he does not view slavery as a necessary evil. Rather, when he sold himself to begin with, it was not because he lacked any other choice, but simply because he doesn't mind being a slave.
chooses.
In other words, what he's saying here is not only what we said earlier. What we said earlier is that after 6 years, we expected you're gonna wake up and smell the coffee. Here he's saying is that after 6 years, we now know what your original intention was. Originally, you said, it's okay. I'm okay being a slave. That's why you did it in the first place. Your whole attitude's got to change from the bottom up, from the foundation up. Jeff, can I trouble you one more time? It goes on a temporary hold. When you put on the heat, it goes on a temporary hold that goes for like 10, 15 minutes, and after there's that. Thank you. Shkoyach. So it may be true that his current wish to remain with his master is not necessarily punishable with ear piercing, inasmuch as he is compelled, at least to some extent, by his natural love of his wife and children. However, he now states, I love my master. We know that he truly does not mind being a slave. He's saying, I love my master. This proves that his initial act of selling himself into slavery was not out of duress, but rather his true wish. And so we punish him for the initial act of actively seeking out a master. He was looking for another master other than God. And so that's why our Parsha begins with this mitzvah. Because we are commanded by the Torah to follow civil law with the recognition that civil law ultimately is based on a divine principle. In other words, yes, honor your parents. Yes, don't take bribes. Yes, you have to, when you are charged with being a guardian, you incur a certain degree of responsibility. Yes, absolutely. But all of these laws themselves are based not only on human rationale, but they're based on a certain acceptance of their being sourced in the divine. They're being given to us by God. So even though these are rational mitzvahs, and we might come to those conclusions ourselves, as many societies have, they've established all kinds of laws, right? You can't just give a bribe, at least not in Western society, and at least not on a regular basis. You can't give a bribe to a judge. Where did they come up with that? They didn't have to look necessarily in the Torah for that. They came up with it on their own. But when we fulfill them based on the principle that even Mishpatim, even civil laws, are based on a divine code, are based on a divine instruction. Now, why is that so important? We mentioned this many times before, but I think it's worthwhile to repeat and repeat. And the idea is because when societies are just based on civil law, that are based on human rationale, it's not long before that society ends up in a tailspin and in a downward spiral, morally, ethically, spiritually, and ultimately they end up undermining their very own laws. And the example that we always bring is Nazi Germany. They were an incredible society, the highest, most prestigious universities and professionals. They were had the greatest etiquette.
I mean, specifically moralists, Kant and all of them. I mean, specific moralists. They wrote the book on it
They wrote the book, exactly. And the Rebbe used to always say, he was in Berlin in the early 30s. They had societies for the protection of animals, not to abuse animals. Don't abuse animals. Don't abuse the dog and a cat. But to kill 6 million Jews based on a theory, that was perfectly acceptable. How did that happen? And the answer is because the civil law was not based on a divine code. It wasn't immutable. It was very much very flexible based on what we come up with. And if we come up with this idea that the Jewish people are a menace to mankind, we got to eradicate them, every single one, man, woman, and child. Doesn't make a difference. Why is that? How do you make that mistake? Because it's not based on a divine code. It's not based on something immutable. If it's based on something immutable, you can't move it. You can't change it. In other words, human rationale, as far as it goes, as bright as we are, as brilliant as we are, as incredibly gifted as the human mind is, ultimately, at the end of the day, the human mind can take us into places where we don't want to go. We shouldn't go. And so Parshas Mishpatim opens up with this mitzvah, with this law, that even our civil laws are all based on the idea that God has given us each a mission and we are the servants of God. Don't be servants to other servants. In other words, we are charged with our mission. And if you relinquish that, you forfeit that willingly, then you get a little pierced there. We want to remind you that, remind society that this is not the way to do things. And so that also answers our question, why the person who does any other sin is not given we don't bore his ear right away. Why? It's the guy who had 6 years to reflect on this. It's the guy who was in slavery for 6 years. He had this opportunity. And at the end, he's set free. He could go free. Now set things right. Now make things right. He says, no, I still want to be a slave. When a person steals because he's destitute, nobody's justifying the stealing. Nobody's saying that it's okay to steal, go rob a bank, at gunpoint or not at gunpoint. Either way, it's a sin. But it's a bad choice made out of impulse at the spur of the moment, or even if it's premeditated, but it's based on a circumstance, based on difficult circumstances, on desperate circumstances. But after 6 years, you're not in a desperate situation. You can go out and you can restart your life again. You chose not to, so that's a problem.
And kind of a vote of Surah, maybe to a degree, just like Nazi Germany. I mean, you have a God. Don't construct gods out of a man. I mean, you have a God. Over here, that just basically says, I have a master who, for 6 years, he showed that the food's there on time, the paycheck's never late, decent pillow, decent wife. I'm trusting this guy more than I
Trust God.
do God. I don't need God. I have my own.
Yeah. So that is the basis for the reason that this is the basis for having this mitzvah right at the beginning of Parshas Mishpatim and having it the first mitzvah after Matan Torah, after the giving of the Torah, because it drives home this point. We are in the service of God. God doesn't want us to be slaves for other people. We are in the service of God. And even those things that we do that are in order to maintain civilized society, ultimately it's about God. Ultimately it's about bringing God into our life, and our daily life, making the world and ourselves and the world around us conscious of God, aware of what God wants them to do with their lives. And so that's why Parshas Mishpatim comes right away after Matan Torah. It's the first parsha, and it begins with this law. And we also answered all the questions about why specifically this person will end up with a pierced ear and not anybody else, because of this important message that we all need to learn. Any questions? Okay, I think we'll wish everybody a good night.